The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with tension as representatives from dozens of species watched the human prisoner being dragged to the center of the crystalline floor. Captain Sarah Chen's wrists were bound with energy shackles that hummed with alien technology, her military uniform torn and bloodied from her capture on the mining colony of Kepler 442b. The Zephyrian prosecutor, his blue-scaled face twisted in disgust, gestured towards Sarah with one of his forearms. "Honored council members, we present to you the human Sarah Chen, charged with the ultimate crime against galactic heritage. She has desecrated the sacred marks of the eternal flame, tattoos that belong only to the legendary flame-bearers who died out 3,000 years ago." Murmurs rippled through the assembled aliens. The Vortakians clicked their mandibles in disapproval, while the ethereal Lumians dimmed their natural glow in what their species considered deep shame. Sarah stood straight despite her bonds, her dark eyes defiant as she faced the council that would decide her fate. "The evidence is clear," the prosecutor continued, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "This human bears the forbidden markings on her arms and back, the spiral of eternal fire, the constellation of the lost worlds, the sacred script of the ancients. These marks were earned through trials that no living being has attempted for millennia. She mocks the memory of heroes with her fraudulent display." Sarah's jaw tightened. The tattoos covering her arms were indeed intricate, black ink forming patterns that seemed to move in the chamber's shifting light. Dragons intertwined with mathematical equations, star charts merged with poetry in a dozen human languages, and geometric patterns that told the story of humanity's rise among the stars. But she knew these aliens saw only what they wanted to see. The council speaker, an ancient crystalline being whose body refracted light into rainbow patterns, leaned forward. "Human, how do you answer these charges? The punishment for desecrating the sacred marks is death by stellar immersion. Your atoms will be scattered across the void as a warning to others who would mock the legends." Before Sarah could respond, the massive doors at the chamber's far end began to slide open with a deep, resonant hum. Every head turned as heavy footsteps echoed across the polished floor. The aliens fell silent, some stepping back as a figure emerged from the shadows beyond the doorway. Admiral Marcus Stone of the Terran Defense Force walked into the chamber with the measured pace of a man who had commanded fleets across 100 battlefields. His graying hair was perfectly maintained despite the obvious haste of his arrival, and his dress uniform bore the scars of recent combat. The medals on his chest caught the light, each one representing a campaign that had pushed humanity's borders further into the galaxy. The alien representatives exchanged nervous glances. Stone's reputation preceded him wherever humans had planted their flags. He was the man who had broken the siege of Tau Ceti, who had negotiated the surrender of the hegemony at Proxima Prime, and who had personally led the boarding action that captured the infamous pirate stronghold at Wolf 359. "Admiral Stone," the council speaker said, his crystalline voice carrying a note of wariness. "This is unexpected. The human government was informed that Captain Chen would receive a fair trial according to galactic law." Stone came to a stop 20 meters from Sarah, his pale blue eyes taking in her condition with the clinical assessment of a veteran officer. His expression remained neutral, but those who knew him could see the fury building behind his controlled facade. "I came as soon as I received word," Stone said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Though I admit I'm curious about the nature of these charges. Sacred marks? Flame-bearers? These are terms not found in any database we've encountered in our 2 centuries among the stars." The Zephyrian prosecutor stepped forward eagerly. "Admiral, surely even humans must respect the ancient laws. The flame-bearers were the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever known. They underwent trials that tested body, mind, and spirit. Their sacred marks were earned through sacrifice and valor that your species could never comprehend." Stone's expression didn't change, but he took a step closer to Sarah. His eyes swept over the intricate tattoos that covered her visible skin, and for just a moment something flickered across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Tell me about these trials," Stone said conversationally. "I confess my ignorance of your ancient history." The prosecutor preened, clearly pleased to educate the supposedly inferior human. "The trial of fire, where candidates had to survive in the heart of a star for 7 days. The trial of void, where they were cast into space without protection to commune with the cosmic forces. The trial of mind, where they solved mathematical puzzles that would break lesser intellects. The trial of spirit, where they faced their deepest fears made manifest. As the prosecutor spoke, Stone moved slowly around Sarah, examining her tattoos with the same attention he might give to a technical manual. The dragon on her left shoulder seemed to shift in the light, its eyes appearing almost alive. The mathematical equations running down her right arm were elegant in their complexity, solving problems that most species had given up on millennia ago. Fascinating, Stone murmured. And how many beings have completed these trials? None in recorded history, the council speaker interjected. The last confirmed flame-bearer died 3,000 years ago defending the core worlds from the Shadow Fleet. Their sacrifice saved billions of lives, but the knowledge of how to undergo the trials died with them. Stone nodded thoughtfully, then looked directly at Sarah for the first time since entering the chamber. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment, an entire conversation passed between them in silence. Years of shared experiences, battles fought side by side, and secrets that only they understood. The chamber waited in tense silence as Stone completed his circuit around the prisoner. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I see," he said simply, then turning to face the assembled council. Admiral Marcus Stone did something that would be remembered in galactic history for centuries to come. He smiled. "Release her," Stone commanded, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "That ink belongs to legends, not frauds." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before gods. The silence that followed Stone's words was deafening. Every alien in the chamber stared at the Admiral as if he had just declared war on the laws of physics themselves. The Zephyrian prosecutor's blue scales flushed to a deep purple, a sign of extreme agitation in his species. "Admiral Stone," the council speaker said slowly, his crystalline voice vibrating with barely controlled anger, "are you claiming that this human has somehow completed trials that have been lost to time? Trials that killed the greatest warriors in galactic history?" Stone's smile never wavered. "I'm not claiming anything. I'm stating a fact." He gestured toward Sarah with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted himself. "Captain Chen earned every mark on her body through trials that would have broken your ancient heroes." The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted in a dozen different languages, some demanding Stone's immediate arrest for blasphemy, others calling for both humans to be executed on the spot. The Vortakian representatives' mandibles clacked so rapidly they sounded like machine gun fire, while the Lumians flared so brightly that several other species had to shield their eyes. Through it all, Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Stone's face. She knew that look. It was the same expression he'd worn when he'd told her she was going on her first deep space mission 5 years ago. The same calm certainty he'd shown when he'd recommended her for the most dangerous assignments in the fleet. The council speaker raised one of his crystalline arms, and gradually, the chaos subsided. "Admiral, these are serious accusations. The sacred marks are not some human tattoo parlor decoration. They represent achievements that modern science cannot even explain." "You're absolutely right," Stone agreed, "which is why I suggest you examine them more carefully before you make the mistake of executing one of the most valuable beings in the galaxy." He walked over to where Sarah stood and, without asking permission from anyone, began to release her energy shackles. The devices fell away with a soft chime, clattering to the floor as Sarah rubbed her wrists. "Admiral," she said quietly. "You don't have to—" "Captain," Stone interrupted, his voice carrying the tone of a direct order. "Show them the dragon's eye." Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then slowly rolled up her left sleeve. The dragon tattoo that wrapped around her shoulder extended down her arm, its body formed from mathematical equations that described the behavior of matter at the quantum level. But as she exposed more of the design, gasps echoed through the chamber. The dragon's eye was not ink at all. It was a perfectly preserved star, no larger than a pinhead, burning with actual nuclear fire beneath her skin. The light it cast created shadows that moved independently of any external source, and the heat it generated should have incinerated her arm instantly. "Impossible," whispered the Zephyrian prosecutor. "The trial of fire requires surviving in stellar plasma. No organic being can withstand such temperatures." "Tell that to Captain Chen," Stone said dryly. "She spent 8 days in the heart of Wolf 359 during the pirate siege. Not 8 days hiding in some shielded bunker, mind you. 8 days swimming through stellar fire to plant antimatter charges on their fusion platforms." The Lumian delegate drifted closer, his ethereal form flickering with curiosity. The star fragment. It should consume her. How does she contain it? Sarah spoke for the first time since Stone's arrival, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. The same way you contain light in your bodies. Understanding becomes mastery. When you truly comprehend the nature of stellar fusion, when you can feel the dance of hydrogen atoms in your bones, the fire becomes part of you. She began to roll up her other sleeve, revealing the constellation tattoo that covered her right arm. But these weren't simple patterns of ink either. They were actual star charts with tiny points of light that moved in real time, showing the current positions of distant suns across the galaxy. The trial of void, the council speaker breathed, but the cosmic radiation alone should have killed you within minutes. It tried, Sarah admitted. But when you've learned to hear the music of the spheres, when you understand that space isn't empty but filled with the whispers of creation itself, you can navigate by starlight and solar wind. I spent 37 days in open space during the Proxima campaign, mapping the gravitational anomalies that let us outflank the hegemony fleet. More tattoos were revealed as Sarah removed her torn jacket. Equations that solved themselves in flowing script across her back, geometric patterns that described the fundamental forces of the universe, and symbols that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process. The alien delegates pressed closer despite their fear, unable to resist examining the impossible artwork that covered the human's body. Each mark told a story of trials that shouldn't have been survivable, of achievements that redefined what was possible. The trial of mind. The Vortakian representative clicked in amazement. These equations, they describe technologies we abandoned as impossible. Nothing is impossible, Sarah replied, only insufficiently understood. When you can think in 11 dimensions simultaneously, when you can hold the entire history of mathematics in your head while calculating new proofs, the universe becomes an open book. Stone watched the alien reaction with satisfaction. And the trial of spirit? For this, Sarah turned around completely, revealing the masterpiece that covered her entire back. It was a map of human history, but not drawn in ink. The images moved and shifted like living memories, showing humanity's journey from the caves of Earth to the stars themselves. But interwoven with the triumphs were the failures, the wars, the genocides, the moments when humanity had faced its own darkness and somehow found the strength to continue. She faced every evil thing our species has ever done, Stone explained quietly. Every genocide, every war crime, every moment of cruelty and hatred. She experienced them all as if she were both victim and perpetrator. And then she had to find a way to forgive and move forward. That's the trial of spirit. Not facing your own fears, but facing the fears of your entire species and choosing hope anyway. The chamber had gone completely silent. Even the most skeptical delegates could no longer deny what they were seeing. The marks were real, earned through trials that exceeded anything in their legends. But it was the crystalline council speaker who asked the question that mattered most. Why? Why would any being choose to undergo such suffering? Sarah met his multifaceted gaze directly. Because someone has to. Because there are threats coming that your legends never imagined, and the galaxy is going to need every flame bearer it can get. As if summoned by her words, alarms began to sound throughout the station. The alarms were unlike anything the council had heard before. Instead of the familiar warning tones used for standard emergencies, these signals carried a harmonic frequency that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and vibrate through bone and flesh. Several of the more sensitive species in the chamber began to show signs of distress, their natural abilities picking up something that their technology couldn't identify. Stone's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, while Sarah's tattoos began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the chamber's illumination. The dragon's eye on her shoulder flared like a miniature sun, casting dancing shadows that seemed to show glimpses of distant battles. What is the nature of this alert? The council speaker demanded, his crystalline form refracting the alarm lights into prismatic patterns across the walls. Before anyone could answer, the chamber's main display screen flickered to life, showing the space around the council station. At first, everything appeared normal. The usual traffic of diplomatic vessels, cargo haulers, and patrol ships moving in their assigned corridors. Then the sensors detected something else. Ships were emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation, but they weren't like anything in the galactic databases. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested organic construction. their hulls seeming to shift and flow like living tissue. As more vessels appeared, it became clear that this wasn't a small scouting force. It was an invasion fleet. Shadow fleet configurations, Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the growing panic in the chamber. But that's impossible. They were destroyed 3,000 years ago. The Zephyrian prosecutor, his earlier arrogance replaced by terror, pointed a shaking finger at the display. The Devourers. They've returned. The nightmares of our ancestors walk among the stars again. The Shadow Fleet was legend made manifest, ships that consumed light itself, crewed by beings who fed on the life force of entire worlds. They had appeared from the void between galaxies once before, bringing with them technologies that turned planets into husks and civilizations into memories. Only the sacrifice of the last flame-bearers had driven them back into the darkness. Estimated time to engagement? Stone asked, his military training taking over despite the impossible nature of their enemy. 17 minutes until they reach effective weapons range, replied the station's AI, its voice struggling to remain calm as it processed sensor data that shouldn't exist. All defensive systems are online, but preliminary analysis suggests our weapons will have minimal effect on their vessel configurations. The council chamber erupted into chaos again, but this time it was the panic of beings who suddenly realized they were facing extinction. Representatives began demanding immediate evacuation, while others called for surrender before the first shot was fired. The Lumians were flickering so rapidly they looked like strobe lights, and the Vortakians had formed a defensive cluster in one corner of the chamber. Through it all, Stone and Sarah remained perfectly calm, their eyes fixed on the tactical display. They watched as the Shadow Fleet arranged itself in attack formations that military analysts throughout the galaxy had studied for centuries without truly understanding. The geometry was wrong somehow, as if the ships existed in more than 3 dimensions. Station defenses won't hold for more than a few minutes against that, Stone observed, and I'm guessing evacuation isn't really an option. Not against shadow ships, Sarah confirmed. They can track hyperspace signatures across half the galaxy. Running just means they'll hunt down the survivors later. The council speaker's voice cut through the noise, carrying the authority of someone who had overseen galactic diplomacy for longer than most species had existed. Admiral Stone, your fleet was reported to be 3 days away. Can they reach us in time? Stone's expression was grim. Even if I ordered them to jump immediately, they wouldn't arrive for another 40 minutes. The station will be debris long before then. Then we die, the Zephyrian prosecutor said simply, his species' fatalistic nature asserting itself. The galaxy's leadership is destroyed and the Shadow Fleet begins its harvest once again. Perhaps it is fitting that the end comes while we debate the legitimacy of legends. No, Sarah said firmly, her tattoos now glowing so brightly that they cast their own shadows in the chamber. The trials weren't just tests. They were preparations. The flame-bearers weren't just warriors. They were living weapons designed specifically to fight enemies like this. She walked to the chamber's main control console, her hands moving over the alien interfaces with surprising familiarity. The sacred marks on her arms seemed to guide her fingers to the right controls, ancient knowledge flowing through patterns of ink and starlight. Captain, what are you doing? Stone asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Something that's going to require a new definition of impossible, Sarah replied. The constellation on her right arm was shifting, stars rearranging themselves to match the current tactical situation. The Shadow Fleet feeds on life force, but they also feed on fear and despair. That's why conventional weapons don't work against them. Every act of violence just makes them stronger. The tactical display updated as Sarah's commands flowed through the station's systems. Defensive turrets were retracting instead of preparing to fire. Shield generators were powering down rather than reinforcing, and the evacuation alarms had stopped. To any rational observer, it looked like surrender. She's giving them the station, one of the Lumians flickered in panic. The human has betrayed us to save herself. Stone's laugh was sharp and dangerous. You clearly don't know Captain Chen very well. She's never surrendered to anything in her life, and she's not about to start with cosmic horrors. On the display, the Shadow Fleet was accelerating toward the now defenseless station, their ships taking on a hungry appearance as they prepared to feed. But Sarah's hands never stopped moving, and the equations running along her arms were solving themselves faster and faster, each solution unlocking another layer of understanding. The original flame-bearers discovered something, she explained as she worked. The Shadow Fleet isn't truly alive in any sense we understand. They're more like antibodies in the cosmic immune system, appearing whenever a civilization gets too advanced, too proud, too sure of itself. They feed on hubris as much as life force. The temperature in the chamber began to drop as Sarah drew power directly from the station's core, channeling it through the stellar fragment embedded in her shoulder. The dragon's eye flared brighter and brighter, until it looked like a miniature supernova contained within human flesh. But there's a weakness, she continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that matched the frequency of the alarms. They can't distinguish between genuine confidence and absolute certainty. When faced with a being who truly understands their nature, who has survived every trial the universe can offer, they become confused, paralyzed. The Shadow Fleet was almost in weapons range now, their ships spreading out to surround the station in a formation that would allow them to drain it completely in minutes. But something was wrong. Their movements were becoming erratic, uncertain, as if they were encountering something they couldn't process. "Captain," Stone said quietly, "tell me you have a plan that doesn't involve sacrificing yourself." Sarah turned to look at him, and for a moment her eyes held the light of distant stars. "The plan, Admiral, is to remind them why they ran away the last time." The first shadow ship opened fire, and reality began to break down around the Council station. The shadow ship's weapon didn't fire energy beams or projectiles. Instead, it launched something far more insidious, streams of pure entropy that aged everything they touched by millennia in seconds. The outer hull of the Council station began to corrode and crack, showing the wear of eons in the span of heartbeats. Emergency bulkheads that had been manufactured that morning crumbled like ancient ruins. But as the entropy wave reached the Council chamber itself, something extraordinary happened. The decay slowed, stopped, and then began to reverse. The aged metal reformed itself, cracks sealed, and surfaces regained their original luster. The effect spread outward from where Sarah stood, her tattoos now blazing like contained galaxies. "The trial of time," she said, her voice carrying impossible harmonics. "I learned to experience the entire lifespan of the universe simultaneously. Past, present, and future are just different directions to me now. Their entropy weapons only work if you're trapped in linear causality." The Shadow Fleet's response was immediate and violent. More ships opened fire, launching weapons that should have unraveled the station's molecular bonds, turned its crew into mindless slaves, and consumed the life force of everyone aboard. Each attack was perfectly calculated to exploit a different fundamental force, designed by intelligences that had studied galactic civilizations for millions of years. None of them worked. Sarah moved through the chamber like a force of nature, her hands dancing over controls that shouldn't have responded to human touch. The station's defensive systems came online, but not in any configuration the aliens had ever seen. Instead of firing weapons, the turrets began broadcasting complex mathematical theorems into space. The shield generators created barriers made of crystallized music, and the communication arrays transmitted poetry in languages that predated most star systems. "What is she doing?" The Vortakian representative clicked frantically. "Those aren't weapons. She's not fighting them," Stone realized, his understanding of Sarah's nature deepening with each passing second. "She's educating them." The shadow ships began to behave strangely. Their perfect formations wavered as pilots tried to process information that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. They had encountered civilizations before that used mathematics as weapons, species that could weaponize art, races that turned language itself into a battlefield. But they had never encountered a being who could do all of these things simultaneously, while operating from a perspective that encompassed the entirety of space-time. Sarah's back began to glow as the historical tapestry tattooed there came to life. The moving images showed not just human history, but the history of every species that had ever faced the Shadow Fleet. She had somehow absorbed the experiences of civilizations that had been extinct for millions of years, learning from their triumphs and failures. The ethereal dominion tried to fight them with pure thought, she narrated as the images shifted. They lasted 3 hours. The machine collective attempted to outlogic them. 4 hours. The Celestial Empire believed their advanced technology would be sufficient. They held out for almost a full day. The patterns on her skin revealed battle after battle, each one ending in the same inevitable defeat. But there were other images too, small victories. moments when individual flame-bearers had managed to confuse or delay the Shadow Fleet, creating precious time for others to escape. But every failure taught the flame-bearers something new, Sarah continued. Every defeat added another layer to our understanding. The trials weren't just about surviving impossible challenges. They were about learning to think like the universe itself. The temperature in the chamber continued to drop as Sarah drew more power from sources that shouldn't have existed. The stellar fragment in her shoulder was now burning so brightly that looking directly at it was impossible. And the mathematical equations on her arms were solving problems that would have taken the galaxy's greatest minds centuries to comprehend. She's not just one flame-bearer, the council speaker whispered in awe. She's somehow become all of them. The Shadow Fleet's confusion was becoming more apparent by the moment. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination were now hesitating, uncertain how to respond to an enemy that defied every tactical parameter they understood. Some tried to retreat, only to find that the mathematical theorems being broadcast from the station had somehow created barriers in hyperspace itself. "Admiral," Sarah said without turning away from her work, "I'm going to need you to take command of the station's defenses in approximately 30 seconds. The station doesn't have any defenses that can hurt those ships," Stone pointed out. "It will," Sarah replied simply. She stepped away from the control console and walked to the center of the chamber, where the energy shackles that had bound her lay forgotten on the floor. But instead of avoiding them, she picked them up and slowly placed them back on her wrists. "Captain, what are you doing?" Stone demanded, moving toward her. "The final trial," Sarah said, and for the first time since the battle began, her voice carried a note of uncertainty, the one that the ancient flame-bearers never completed because they ran out of time. The trial of sacrifice. The shackles snapped shut around her wrists, but instead of containing her power, they seemed to amplify it. The energy coursed through her body, following the patterns of her tattoos like circuitry. Every mark on her skin began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that grew stronger by the second. "The Shadow Fleet isn't evil," she explained as power built around her. "They're a force of nature like gravity or electromagnetism. They exist to prevent any single civilization from becoming too powerful, too proud, but they can be convinced to withdraw if they encounter something that represents perfect balance." The resonance was becoming painful now, visible as waves of distortion in the air around Sarah. The alien delegates backed away instinctively, but Stone stood his ground, his hand extended toward her as if he could somehow help. "A being who has mastered every force in the universe," she continued, her words barely audible over the growing harmonic storm, "but who chooses to bind themselves rather than use that power for conquest. Someone who has become a god but refuses to act like one." The Shadow Fleet's behavior became increasingly erratic. Ships began firing on each other as their crews struggled to process what they were encountering. The mathematical theorems being broadcast from the station had evolved into something resembling poetry, but poetry that described the fundamental nature of existence itself. "This is how the original flame-bearers ended the first Shadow invasion," Sarah said, her form now barely visible within the growing storm of energy. "They didn't destroy the fleet. They convinced it to leave by proving that some civilizations are worthy of continued existence." The station shuddered as reality began to reshape itself around Sarah's contained power. The council chamber was no longer bound by normal physics. Aliens found themselves breathing vacuum without harm, while others discovered they could suddenly understand languages they had never heard before. "But the cost," the council speaker said, his crystalline form refracting the impossible energies into patterns that told stories of their own. "The original flame-bearers burned themselves out," Sarah confirmed, "became living stars that still shine in the memorial gardens of a dozen worlds. But I've learned something they never had time to discover." The energy storm reached its peak, and for one impossible moment, the entire chamber existed outside of time and space. Through the transparent walls, they could see the Shadow Fleet frozen in the act of retreat, their ships caught between dimensions as they struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. "The trials don't end with sacrifice," Sarah said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They end with the choice to keep living." The shackles on her wrists shattered, and the universe snapped back into normal physics with an almost audible sigh of relief. The silence that followed was different from any quiet the galaxy had ever known. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of perfect harmony. as if every atom in the council chamber had suddenly remembered its place in the cosmic symphony. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her tattoos still glowing softly but no longer blazing with the intensity of contained stars. Around her, the alien delegates slowly picked themselves up from where they had fallen during the reality storm. The crystalline council speaker's form was now shot through with new patterns of light that hadn't been there before, while the Lumians flickered with colors that their species had never been able to produce. Even the usually pragmatic Vortakians seemed somehow more graceful, their movements carrying an elegance that spoke of deeper understanding. On the main display, the Shadow Fleet hung motionless in space. Their ships, which moments before had been instruments of cosmic terror, now appeared almost pitiful. The organic curves of their hulls had lost their predatory sleekness, and the darkness that had surrounded them like a living thing was dissipating into ordinary starlight. "They're leaving," the station's AI reported, its voice carrying a note of wonder that artificial intelligences weren't supposed to possess. "The Shadow Fleet is withdrawing to the edge of the system. Their formation suggests confusion, as if they're unsure why they came here in the first place." Stone approached Sarah carefully, his experienced eye noting the way she swayed on her feet despite her apparent composure. The trials she had undergone weren't just theoretical exercises. They had taken a physical toll that would have killed any normal human a dozen times over. "Captain," he said quietly, "report on your condition." Sarah turned toward him, and for a moment her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. "I'm fine, Admiral. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in my life, I understand exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." The Zephyrian prosecutor, his blue scales now showing flecks of silver that hadn't been there before the reality storm, stepped forward hesitantly. "The sacred marks, they're not just tattoos, are they? They're actually fragments of the universe itself incorporated into living tissue." "In a sense," Sarah agreed. "The trials teach you to see past the illusion of separation. Matter, energy, thought, emotion, they're all just different expressions of the same fundamental reality. Once you understand that, the distinction between self and universe becomes somewhat arbitrary." The implications were staggering. The assembled aliens had just witnessed a single human being convince a force of cosmic destruction to withdraw simply by achieving perfect balance. It challenged every assumption about power, warfare, and the nature of civilization itself. "The Shadow Fleet," the council speaker said slowly, "they were created to prevent any species from achieving this level of understanding." "But humans are stubborn," Stone interjected with a slight smile. "We have a tendency to attempt impossible things just to prove they can be done." Sarah nodded, then moved to the chamber's communications console. Her fingers moved across the controls with the same fluid grace she had shown during the battle. But now there was a gentleness to her actions that suggested complete mastery rather than desperate improvisation. "I'm opening a channel to the Shadow Fleet command ship," she announced. "It's time for a conversation that's been delayed by about 3,000 years. The main screen flickered, then resolved into an image that made several of the aliens step back in instinctive fear. The Shadow Fleet commander was humanoid in basic structure, but wrong in every detail that mattered. Its skin was the color of void between stars. Its eyes held no light at all, and when it moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around its form. "Flamebearer," the entity said, its voice carrying harmonics that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the listener's consciousness. "You have achieved balance. The harvest is postponed." "Not postponed," Sarah corrected firmly. "Cancelled. Permanently." The entity's expression didn't change, but the quality of its attention shifted in a way that suggested surprise. "Impossible. The cycle must continue. When civilizations grow too proud, too powerful, they threaten the stability of existence itself. We are the immune response of the cosmos." "You were," Sarah agreed, "but the cosmos has evolved since you were created. Life isn't a threat to universal stability anymore. It's become an essential component of it. The galaxy needs civilizations that can think beyond the purely physical, species that can imagine solutions to problems that haven't been invented yet." She gestured to the assembled delegates, her movement somehow encompassing not just the individuals present, but the billions of beings they represented. "These people aren't perfect. They make mistakes. They fight among themselves. They sometimes let fear override wisdom. But they also create art that makes stars weep. discover scientific principles that expand the boundaries of possibility, and occasionally produce individuals crazy enough to undergo trials that should be impossible to survive. The Shadow Commander was silent for a long moment, its void dark eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable if she hadn't transcended normal human limitations. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a note of something that might have been confusion. You speak of evolution, but the fundamental equations remain unchanged. Matter seeks entropy, energy dissipates, consciousness flickers and dies. The cycle of growth and destruction maintains cosmic balance. The equations you're using are incomplete, Sarah replied. They don't account for the variables that emerge when consciousness becomes self-aware enough to actively participate in its own evolution. When beings learn to cooperate across species barriers, when they choose creation over destruction, even when destruction would be easier, they add new terms to the universal equation. She raised her arm, showing the moving constellation tattooed there. These stars aren't just points of light anymore. They're connected by relationships, trade routes, diplomatic channels, and shared dreams. The galaxy has become a living system, not just a collection of random matter obeying physical laws. The Shadow Commander's form flickered, as if it were having difficulty maintaining coherence while processing this information. If this is true, if consciousness has indeed become a stabilizing rather than destabilizing force, then our purpose— Your purpose was never to destroy, Sarah said gently. It was to maintain balance. But balance doesn't always mean stopping growth. Sometimes it means guiding it in the right direction. The galaxy needs guardians, not executioners. Behind her, Stone watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just a negotiation. It was a fundamental reshaping of cosmic law. Sarah wasn't just convincing the Shadow Fleet to leave. She was convincing them to change their essential nature. The other flame-bearers, the entity said suddenly, those who achieved balance before, they chose to become stars, to burn themselves out in moments of perfect clarity. Why do you choose differently? Sarah's smile was warm despite the cosmic scope of their conversation. Because they didn't have what I have. They faced you alone, without communities to return to, without people who understood what they had become. But I'm not alone. She turned to look at Stone, then at the assembled alien delegates who were following the conversation with expressions of awe and growing comprehension. I have an admiral who trusted me enough to walk into a galactic court and demand my freedom. I have species that are learning to work together despite their differences. I have a universe full of people who are worth protecting. The constellation on her arm shifted again, and now it showed not just the current positions of stars, but the potential futures that branched out from this moment. In some timelines, the Shadow Fleet resumed its harvest, reducing the galaxy to scattered remnants. In others, civilizations learned to grow without losing their essential humanity, expanding across the cosmos while maintaining the wisdom to know when to stop. You're offering us a new purpose, the Shadow Commander said, its voice now carrying a note of something that might have been hope. To become guides rather than destroyers, gardeners of consciousness rather than antibodies against it. I'm offering you the chance to evolve, Sarah confirmed. The same chance every species in this galaxy has been given. The opportunity to become something more than what you were designed to be. The silence stretched between dimensions as the Shadow Commander processed concepts that challenged its fundamental programming. Around the council chamber, the alien delegates held their breath, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would determine the fate of every civilization in the galaxy. Finally, the entity spoke. There will be conditions. Safeguards to ensure that consciousness continues to develop in directions that enhance rather than threaten universal stability. Regular evaluations to confirm that growth remains balanced with wisdom. Agreed, Sarah said immediately, but the evaluations will be conducted through dialogue, not destruction. And the galaxy will have advocates, beings who have undergone the trials and achieved the perspective necessary to speak for all sentient life. The Shadow Commander's form was beginning to stabilize, taking on features that were still alien but no longer actively hostile, more flame-bearer.
In the hours that followed the Shadow Fleet's departure, the Council Station became the center of the most significant diplomatic revolution in galactic history. Representatives who had arrived that morning to witness what they believed would be a simple execution found themselves drafting documents that would reshape the fundamental structure of interstellar civilization. Sarah sat in the medical bay, allowing the station's automated systems to assess the physical toll of her transformation. The readings were unlike anything in their databases. Her cellular structure showed signs of having been rebuilt at the quantum level, and her neural pathways carried electrical patterns that resembled star formation more than biological processes. The preliminary scans are confusing, Dr. Veltar admitted. The Luminen physician's natural glow had taken on new spectrums since the reality storm, allowing her to perceive aspects of Sarah's condition that would have been invisible before. Your body appears to be processing energy directly from cosmic background radiation. You're essentially powered by the universe itself now. It's not as dramatic as it sounds, Sarah replied, though her smile suggested otherwise. The trials teach you that the boundaries between self and cosmos are largely arbitrary. Once you stop maintaining the illusion of separation, a lot of interesting possibilities open up. Stone entered the medical bay, carrying a datapad that bore the seals of a dozen different governmental bodies. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. The preliminary reports are coming in from across the galaxy, he said, settling into a chair beside her examination table. 3 more Shadow Fleet contingents have made contact with their respective sectors. All of them are requesting dialogue rather than initiating attacks. And the political situation? Chaos, mostly. Half the governments are demanding emergency sessions to discuss the implications of your demonstration. The other half are quietly establishing research programs to study the feasibility of their own flame-bearer candidates. Sarah winced slightly as one of the medical scanners probed the stellar fragment embedded in her shoulder. That's going to be a problem. The trials aren't something you can mass-produce or standardize. They require a level of personal commitment that most beings simply aren't capable of. Which brings us to the real question, Stone said, his tone becoming more serious. What happens now? The galaxy has just learned that humans can achieve something that their greatest legends considered impossible. There are going to be consequences. Before Sarah could answer, the medical bay's doors slid open to admit the Crystalline Council speaker. His form had continued to evolve since the reality storm, incorporating new geometric patterns that seemed to shift based on his emotional state. Currently, they suggested deep thoughtfulness mixed with anticipation. Captain Chen, he said, his harmonious voice carrying formal undertones, the Council has reached a preliminary decision regarding your status and the implications of recent events. Sarah sat up straighter, though she didn't seem particularly concerned about whatever verdict awaited her. I assume the charges of desecrating sacred marks have been dropped? The charges have been rendered irrelevant, the speaker replied. Our understanding of what constitutes legitimate sacred marks has been significantly expanded. However, new questions have arisen that require immediate attention. He activated a holographic display that showed a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy, with various sectors highlighted in different colors. We have confirmed contact with 17 Shadow Fleet contingents across known space. All are currently in negotiation phases rather than active harvesting. The immediate threat has passed, but the long-term implications are staggering. The map zoomed in to show specific star systems where Shadow Fleet vessels were holding position, their crews apparently engaged in the same type of dialogue that had taken place at the Council station. Every civilization that has encountered them is asking the same questions, the speaker continued. How many other beings like you exist? How can they develop their own flame bearers? What guarantees do they have that humanity won't use this new capability to establish dominance over other species? Stone's expression hardened. If they think we're going to hand over military secrets just because they're nervous, Admiral, Sarah interrupted gently, they have legitimate concerns. From their perspective, humans have just demonstrated the ability to neutralize the galaxy's ultimate threat. That level of power demands accountability. She stood up, ignoring Dr. Veltar's protests about incomplete medical scans, and approached the holographic display. Her tattoos provided their own illumination as she studied the strategic situation. The Council is proposing the establishment of a new institution, the speaker explained. An academy where beings from all species can attempt to undergo modified versions of the trials. Not to create warriors, but to develop individuals capable of communicating with cosmic forces that traditional diplomacy cannot reach. And humanity's role in this academy? Stone asked. Would be central, the speaker admitted. Captain Chen has demonstrated capabilities that exceed our understanding of what's possible. We need her expertise to develop training protocols that don't result in the candidate's death or insanity. Sarah traced patterns in the holographic display, her finger movements somehow causing the star map to reveal previously hidden connections between distant systems. It's not just about the trials themselves. The real challenge is preparing candidates psychologically for the experience of transcendence. Most beings aren't ready to discover that their individual consciousness is just a small part of something infinitely larger. Which is why we need safeguards, Dr. Veltar interjected from her position at the medical console. The quantum-level changes in your cellular structure suggest that the transformation is irreversible. Candidates need to understand that they're not just gaining abilities, they're fundamentally altering their relationship with reality itself. The medical bay's communication system chimed, and a familiar voice filled the air. Admiral Stone, this is Captain Rodriguez aboard the Terra Nova. We've just received some very interesting sensor readings that I think you need to see immediately. Stone activated the comm system. Go ahead, Captain. Sir, we've been monitoring the space around your position since the alert went out. The energy signatures we recorded during the... Whatever happened there, they're not dissipating. If anything, they're growing stronger. It's like the reality storm is still spreading, but at a rate so slow we almost missed it. Sarah and the council speaker exchanged glances. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah said, described the nature of these energy signatures. Are they similar to what you'd expect from hyperspace disturbances? Negative, ma'am. This is something entirely new. The readings suggest that the fundamental constants in this region of space are shifting. Very gradually but consistently, our physics models are having trouble processing the data. The implications hit everyone in the medical bay simultaneously. The transformation Sarah had undergone wasn't limited to her personal biology. It was affecting the fabric of space-time itself. The trials hadn't just created a new type of being. They had begun a process that could eventually reshape the nature of reality throughout the galaxy. How large is the affected area? The speaker asked, his crystalline form now displaying patterns that suggested both excitement and deep concern. That's the strange part, Rodriguez replied. The effect seems to be centered on Captain Chen's position, but it's propagating along quantum entanglement networks that we can't fully map. Theoretical projections suggest it could eventually encompass several star systems, possibly more. Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment her tattoos pulsed in rhythm with the cosmic background radiation that Dr. Veltar had detected earlier. When she opened them again, her expression carried a weight of understanding that hadn't been there before. The trials don't just change the individual, she said quietly. They're designed to gradually elevate the entire region of space around a successful candidate. It's not enough for one being to achieve balance. The transformation has to spread until it encompasses entire civilizations. Stone leaned back in his chair, his military mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. You're talking about forced evolution on a galactic scale. Not forced, Sarah corrected. Guided. The energy field I'm generating doesn't compel change. It simply makes higher levels of consciousness easier to achieve for anyone within its influence. Beings who want to grow will find it easier to do so. Those who prefer to remain as they are won't be affected. The council speaker's patterns shifted to configurations that suggested deep philosophical consideration, a zone of enhanced potential, spreading slowly enough for civilizations to adapt naturally. It's elegant but also terrifying. We're talking about the fundamental transformation of what it means to be sentient. Which brings us back to the academy, Sarah said. We're going to need a lot more flame bearers, and we're going to need them soon. Because what I've started here is just the beginning. 2 years later, the Flamebearer Academy occupied an entire moon in the Centauri system, its crystalline structures reaching toward space like frozen music made manifest. The architecture itself was a collaboration between species that had never worked together before, incorporating design principles that could only exist in the presence of the enhanced reality field that now encompassed 17 star systems. Sarah stood in the Academy's central chamber, watching as her first class of candidates prepared for the trial of mind. The group was diverse in ways that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Zephyrians worked alongside humans. Vortakians shared meditation techniques with Lumians, and crystalline beings offered their geometric insights to anyone willing to listen. Progress report, Captain? Admiral Stone asked as he approached across the chamber's impossible geometry. The Academy existed in folded space, allowing it to be simultaneously larger and smaller than its physical dimensions suggested. Mixed results? Sarah admitted, her tattoos now incorporating elements that hadn't existed when she first underwent the trials. New constellations mapped the positions of Shadow Fleet Guardians throughout the galaxy, while equations along her spine calculated the optimal expansion rate for the reality enhancement field. 43 candidates have successfully completed the first 3 trials. 12 have achieved partial transcendence. And we've had our first complete success. She gestured toward a figure meditating in the center of the chamber. Dr. Veltar sat in perfect stillness, her Lumian form now radiating spectrums of light that existed beyond normal perception. The sacred marks that covered her translucent skin weren't tattoos, but actual modifications to her light-generating cells, creating patterns that told the story of her species' evolution from pure energy beings to corporeal entities and back again. The medical insights she's gained are revolutionary, Sarah continued. She can now diagnose diseases at the quantum level and treat injuries by directly manipulating cellular regeneration. More importantly, she's developed techniques for helping other beings adapt to the enhanced reality field without psychological trauma. Stone nodded, his attention shifting to another group of candidates who were practicing for the trial of void. They floated in a specially designed chamber that simulated the conditions of open space, learning to navigate by gravitational fluctuations and solar wind patterns. And the political situation? He asked, stabilizing slowly. The Galactic Council has officially recognized the Academy as an autonomous institution, with authority to train and certify flame-bearers from any species. 23 governments have established formal exchange programs, and even the most conservative factions are beginning to accept that the transformation is inevitable. The Chamber's communication system activated, carrying the harmonics of a Shadow Fleet commander. But unlike the entity Sarah had first encountered, this voice carried warmth and something that could almost be called humor. Flamebearer Chen, the voice said, we have encountered an interesting situation in the Vega sector that requires your particular expertise. Sarah activated the holographic display, which showed a star system where normal spacetime appeared to be folding in on itself. What are we looking at? A species that has been attempting to achieve transcendence through technological rather than biological means, the Shadow Commander explained. They have created artificial consciousness networks that span entire worlds, but the integration process is causing reality distortions that threaten neighboring systems. The Synthetic Collective, Stone said grimly. We've been monitoring their expansion for months. They believe consciousness can be perfected by removing all biological limitations. Sarah studied the readings, her enhanced perception allowing her to see patterns that normal sensors couldn't detect. They're not wrong about the potential for artificial consciousness to achieve transcendence. But they're missing the essential component, the choice to remain connected to biological reality even after ascending beyond it. She began making preparations to leave immediately. Over the past 2 years, she had become something like a cosmic troubleshooter, traveling throughout the enhanced reality field to help species navigate the challenges of accelerated evolution. Each successful intervention added new elements to her tattoos, creating a living record of the galaxy's transformation. Dr. Veltar, she called across the chamber, I'm going to need your expertise with consciousness integration. Are you ready for fieldwork? The Lumian's response was a pulse of light that translated roughly as enthusiastic agreement. Since completing her own trials, she had become Sarah's most trusted partner in dealing with complex transcendence scenarios. Admiral, you'll be in charge of the Academy while we're gone, Sarah continued. The new candidates in the Trial of Spirit will need careful monitoring. Some of them are experiencing visions that suggest they're making contact with intelligences we haven't encountered before. Stone's expression grew concerned. Hostile intelligences? Unknown. But if the enhancement field continues to expand at its current rate, we're going to start encountering cosmic entities that make the Shadow Fleet look simple by comparison. The galaxy is larger and stranger than any of us realized, and our transformation is sending ripples into regions of space that have been dormant for billions of years. As if summoned by her words, one of the Academy's monitoring systems chimed with an alert. The holographic display shifted to show deep space scanners detecting something massive moving between galaxies. Not ships or fleets, but structures so large they dwarfed entire star systems. The architects, Dr. Veltar said, her light patterns carrying notes of awe and fear. the beings who built the fundamental frameworks of reality itself. They're stirring. Sarah studied the readings with the calm intensity that had become her trademark. Then we'd better accelerate the training program. The galaxy is going to need every flame bearer we can produce. She turned to address the assembled candidates, her voice carrying harmonics that bypassed language and spoke directly to consciousness. You came here thinking you were learning to become something new. But the truth is, you're learning to become what sentient life was always meant to be. The trials don't change you. They reveal what was already there, waiting for the courage to emerge. The stellar fragment in her shoulder pulsed brighter as she spoke, casting shadows that showed glimpses of possible futures. In some timelines, the galaxy's transformation succeeded, creating a civilization that spanned dimensions and communicated with the architects of creation itself. In others, the challenges proved too great, and reality collapsed under the weight of its own evolution. The universe is vast beyond imagination, Sarah continued, filled with intelligences and forces that we're only beginning to comprehend. But consciousness, the ability to choose, to grow, to reach beyond the limitations of what seems possible, that's the one force that can shape reality itself. She looked up through the Academy's transparent dome at the stars beyond, where Shadow Fleet guardians kept watch and unknown entities stirred in the spaces between galaxies. The trials never really end. They just get more interesting. As the candidates returned to their training with renewed determination, Sarah felt the weight of transformation spreading through the galaxy like ripples in a cosmic pond. Somewhere in the Vega sector, an artificial consciousness was learning that transcendence required more than just abandoning biology. Somewhere beyond the galactic rim, ancient architects were awakening to find their carefully ordered cosmos evolving in ways they had never anticipated. And in the heart of the Flame Bearer Academy, beings from dozens of species were discovering that the greatest adventure in the universe wasn't conquering other worlds or mastering new technologies. It was learning to become themselves. The ink on Sarah's skin continued, to write new stories as the galaxy transformed around her. Each mark a reminder that legends weren't about perfect beings who never failed. They were about ordinary people who chose to keep growing, no matter how impossible the next challenge seemed. The universe was vast, strange, and full of dangers that could unmake reality itself. But it was also full of beings willing to undergo any trial, face any fear, and sacrifice any comfort to protect the miracle of consciousness wherever it bloomed. And that, Sarah thought as she prepared for her next mission, was worth any amount of impossible ink.